On November 5, 1952, at 4 a.m., Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky was awakened by strong underground shocks. Houses were swaying and cracking, plaster was falling on sleeping people, and dishes were falling off shelves. People were panicking and running out onto the streets, and for the next 5 minutes, they felt the ground shaking beneath their feet. Then everything calmed down. At that moment, somewhere in the quiet ocean near the epicenter of the earthquake, a wave of monstrous proportions appeared. With incredible speed, it rushed toward the shores of Kamchatka and the Kuril Islands. Within half an hour, it engulfed the land and then receded, taking with it border guards, boats, several villages on the Kuril Islands and Kamchatka, and the entire city of Severo-Kurilsk. After the first wave came the second and then the third. Thousands of people were forever lost to the ocean. Nowhere was land visible, everything was underwater. The next day, a solemn parade was held in Moscow to mark the anniversary of the Great October Revolution. Comrade Stalin himself was in attendance, and all the country's newspapers congratulated the workers on this important date. Nowhere was it mentioned that just yesterday a terrible tragedy had occurred, which had claimed the lives of thousands of Soviet citizens. The documents containing information about this disaster were immediately stamped top secret. At 4 a.m., a strong earthquake woke the residents of Severo-Kurilsk. The lamp swayed from the ceiling, glass cracked, and people began to run out onto the streets. Earthquakes were common in these parts, and many had even gotten used to them. However, this time was worse than usual. After 5 minutes, the shock stopped, and the weather was clear. The moon was shining, and it was even warm, despite it being November. Calming down, the townspeople began to disperse to their homes. They had no idea that this was only the beginning of the nightmare that would befall them in a few minutes. At the same time, the head of Severo-Kurilsk's police department, Deryabin, left his house to check on the prisoners who were being held in the detention center. The ground was still trembling in places, and cracks were visible in the earth from the earthquake. Upon arriving at the scene, he saw that the building where the prisoners were being held was almost split in two. They quickly began to decide where to move some of the people. However, a terrible rumble was heard from the ocean, and when they looked back, they could not believe their eyes. A huge wave was heading straight toward them. Deryabin ordered them to open fire and shout, "The wave is coming," after which they ran towards the hills. At this time, people, hearing the frightening rumble, began to run out of their homes. Many were in their underwear and barefoot. It seemed that the whole town was plunging into the ocean abyss. The huge wave destroyed houses like sand and carried away people who, in panic, were trying to reach the hills. After a few minutes, the wave receded, taking with it the destroyed houses and hundreds of victims. Surviving people saw how the water receded, revealing the edge of the coastline. Wet stones sparkled in the moonlight, and a sinister silence hung in the air. After waiting a little longer, they began to descend from the hills to see what had happened to their homes. Besides, many of their relatives were still below and did not have time to climb heights. 20 minutes later, the second wave came. A huge 15-meter-high wave with monstrous force hit Paramusher Island in the area of Severo-Kurilsk. Breaking into two parts, one wave ran to the northeast promontory, destroying everything living in its path. The second wave hit Severo-Kurilsk. The huge wave destroyed surviving houses, cars and people were spinning in the whirlpool and the destroyed structures. The second wave brought even more destruction. With tremendous force, it began to retreat, forming a huge whirlpool that caught the surviving people. Striking the coastal shaft, it destroyed the seaport and scattered fishing boats and barges like splinters. It was the second wave that completely destroyed the city and took with it a large part of the population. The third wave was weaker, but it completed the destruction and threw many fragments onto the shore. The city was completely destroyed, and only a small part of the buildings located on the high ground survived. House debris, people's belongings, and survivors who remained on the hills and did not descend into the city after the first wave peered down trying to understand what had happened. However, in the pre-dawn haze, nothing was visible from the city except for the sound of water. After some time, reconnaissance planes began to fly over the island, and pilots surveyed the extent of the damage and photographed the area. Soon, a rescue boat appeared, but it was difficult to break through to the flooded city due to the debris and wreckage everywhere. Propellers were getting tangled in fishing nets. Rescuers and military personnel arrived at the scene, and an operation to eliminate the consequences of the natural disaster began. Unfortunately, some decided to take advantage of this terrible natural disaster. According to archival reports, military personnel at the garrison, including the officer corps, gathered alcohol and brandy that were scattered throughout the city. After getting drunk, they began to engage in looting. In one of the destroyed fish factories, a safe was found containing 280,000 rubles that belonged to the enterprise. The safe was opened, and the money was stolen. Another post office safe was found by unknown persons. They opened it and put the money in a bag, after which they tried to escape but were apprehended and handed over to the military prosecutor. Senior Lieutenant Rezva ordered border guards to collect bags of grain and barrels of vegetable oil in the area of the destroyed warehouses and bring them to the military unit. The military personnel was detained after the completion of the liquidation of the consequences of the disaster. Many washed-away settlements were not restored due to this, and as a result, the population of the islands significantly decreased in the mid-1950s. Severo-Kurilsk was rebuilt on a hill, but again, one important factor was not taken into account: the city was once again in a dangerous zone vulnerable to mudflows during the eruption of one of the most active volcanoes on the Kuril Islands, and Beck's terrible events of 1952 showed that Severo-Kurilsk was not prepared for such a menacing phenomenon as a tsunami. No one told the residents how to act in such situations, and in general, the city was built on the principle of economic expediency, and no one thought about safety. Many viewers of Severo-Kurilsk did not even ask themselves the